Good day, my name is H.B. Charles Jr., pastor of the Shiloh Metropolitan Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Florida. I also write a blog that can be found at www.hbcharlesjr.com. I'm glad to have with me today a friend and brother and colleague, George Hurtt, who is the pastor of the Mount Sinai Missionary Baptist Church in Los Angeles, California. He's the pastor of home church where I met the Lord, where my faith was nurtured. And I'm glad to have him here. He's been here to speak in a celebration, actually, of 4 years of service here for me at the Shiloh Church. And he has graciously consented to let me chat him up a little bit. Welcome.
Good to be here. Thank you.
All right. Tell us a little bit about yourself, George.
Born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. Moved to California in 2000. Grew up in a Pentecostal household. My younger years, when my father passed away, we went back. My mother went back to the Baptist church. That's where I received my training and as it relates to Jesus Christ and so on. Mm-hmm. After finished grad school, I moved to California. I was in the Navy for 3 years. Moved to Los Angeles shortly after, went to seminary, and that's where me and you met at Mount Sinai. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get on to the rest of the story.
Yeah, that's like just dips and pulling and
sure.
Specifics, yeah.
Okay, but I didn't know this. Your initial church roots were Pentecostal.
Well, initial church roots was Baptist. Then my mother married Pentecostal, Black Baptist, so yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. So tell me when and how you met the Lord.
It's a process of, I always say I grew up in a dictatorship, not a democracy. So I met the Lord through my mother telling me, go down the aisle and get baptized, you join the church. So for me, there's not this magical moment as much as it is a development throughout my childhood when I believed to know more about what it is and meant to be a believer and become more dedicated to it, especially through my father and just seeing his life and his dedication to the Lord. So it was definitely a process of me understanding what it is that my parents was telling me that I had to do. And it really, I think I really got serious about my walk in high school. It's right about 9th grade or so.
When your father passed, how old were you?
I was 13.
13?
Yeah, right before high school.
Right before high school. How did that play in to your maybe turning to the Lord a little more seriously?
I think it had a lot to do with it because I believe it wasn't until then, as in most situations, I started to appreciate him and my relationship with him. So it was at that point that I started to appreciate the things I saw him do, prayer, the Bible study, the stuff that irritated me originally, and then even being there during his whole sickness, and the things he invested in me in personal conversations. So it started me to be serious, and then it started this passion I had, just real unusual at that age for preaching. So not for me to be a preacher, but just listening to preaching and wanting to hear preaching and wanting to go where preaching was. It just no agenda, no sense of one day I'm gonna be a preacher. It was just the Lord just giving me a passion, like a kid would have passion for sports. A kid would have passion for. So I would wake up listening to sermons. My mom, the rest of my friends were being dropped off at parties. I was being dropped off at revivals. First time I heard you, I was 15. Didn't have my driver's license. I snuck in. Didn't sneak, but my mother allowed me to use the car with a permit, not quite a license, to hear you preach. And that was just a magical moment and so on. I remember 16 begging an older gentleman to drive to the convention with me if I can go pick up CDs and go to hear late nights and stuff like that. So it was that's how that had developed in me, and just having this appreciation for hearing sermons that helped me understand the Bible better. And at the time, I wouldn't call it expository preaching, but it was just this unconscious passion to hear biblical preaching and to know that if I go home and read this story, I'll understand the story better because I heard that sermon.
Yeah, good deal.
So, yeah, it's a very interesting process.
When in this process do you begin to sense a call to preach in your own life?
I would say right about my senior year in high school, there was friends around me that I was developing that their dads were preachers. My pastor growing up, Pastor James Jennings Sr., his grandsons, and I would be around them unconsciously because I would bump into them in places where their dad was preaching or others were preaching. And when that relationship started to develop and we started arguing about preaching and stuff like that, it just became more real to me about that possibility. But around about the 11th grade, I felt like the Lord was calling me to preach, but I wasn't going to tell nobody. And my plan was to go off to college, and then I'll be good, you know. And so I kept to myself to that 12th grade year when I really felt I just isolated myself. I mean, people would be looking for me, and I would be just at home by myself. And I made it off to college, but that didn't work. So the summer between my first year, between my sophomore year and freshman year of college, I was at Wilberforce University in Ohio, and I had to let my pastor know. And he was so gracious and loving, and walked me through the process, preached my first sermon that August.
How old are you when you preached your first sermon?
18.
You're 18 years old.
Yeah.
Do you remember what your first sermon was?
I do.
Yeah. Do you dare tell us?
Still in the storm. Mark 4. I think 25 through 31. Where's your faith? Yeah, my mother has that tape.
Oh boy.
And it will never be seen.
Blackmail material.
Anything to say about it? You know, it was at that time another good friend of mine, a pastor in Chicago now, Pastor Everett Jennings Jr. had maybe began preaching about a year earlier, and my pastor allowed him to help me in developing the sermon. Then he read over it, and then August is his anniversary. Just show his spirit. I still have my first sermon after his afternoon service to celebrate his anniversary, and obviously, like most people, just a nervous wreck. And then I went back to college like 2 weeks later. I went back to Ohio. But that was my last year there. I transferred back to the University of Detroit to sit under him, and that's where I finished my undergrad studies.
What were you studying?
Religious studies and healthcare administration. It was a dual major. Before I transferred, I was a healthcare administration major. Started to take more religious studies classes. One of the directors, department heads of religious studies challenged me to try to pick up this as a second major, and so I did. So I was a dual major undergrad.
What is your developmental process as a preacher like? What's going on during that period?
I think my first years of preaching, the one thing that was consciously being instilled in me as it relates to the development as a preacher was servanthood, like just servanthood, just being there until the pastor left, making sure someone carried the pastor bag, making sure if the pastor's car needed to get washed, to do that, and just being around him and his wife and seeing how he interacted with his wife, how he was outside of the pulpit, to be able to walk in his study and know when I went to pick up the car keys or drop off any clothes from the cleaners and so on, that he'll be in the study and reading scriptures and preparing for Sunday. And so my first aspect of development was just being intimately close to Pastor James Jennings Sr., just being able to be around him, drive him places to preach and watch him. And it was an unconscious development in a sense, where I was just being a servant, being available, being in the right place. If he needed someone to preach, being ready in those occurrences. Again, I was I was, the lack of a better term, ignorant to some of the formal terminology, formal aspects of sermonic development that I would later get, meeting yourself and going to seminary and things of that nature. I couldn't define expository preaching. I couldn't maybe define or maybe to echo some of the core doctrines that we may hold close to now. But those life principles, those things of being a young preacher and knowing when I'm around certain preachers, you don't talk and just always being there. That was the early stage of that development. As I began to read more, become familiar with more books and get more formal training, and especially my time in LA under yourself, I began to add to that some of the more technical and formal aspects of that already, that foundation.
What happens after college?
College, I look at seminaries, and I was surprised by this notion of seminaries that didn't believe in the Bible, and it was discouraging. I was not aware enough of other seminaries as I probably should have been, but for whatever the case, I was not. And so I decided to pursue graduate studies in my other major, Health Service Administration. So I ended up going to the University of Michigan. Backtrack, I finished, it was a controversy about me getting my second religious studies degree. I was told I just need to do 30 credits in religious studies. I'll have a degree. I was later told I need to do 30 credits above my regular requirement, plus the 30 credits in religious studies. So at one point I thought I would graduate early with the 2 degrees, but I found out I couldn't. But, and it was at a point where it would just seem like I was just going to do those 30 credits for nothing. But I had an opportunity to finish that through a special program with the University of Detroit Mercy that had with Wycliffe Hall in Oxford. And so I was able to study Reformation and Renaissance Studies and finish my degree in Oxford University under Alistair McGrath at Wycliffe Hall. Amazing experience. And then from there, I was also applying to go to school at the University of Michigan for grad school after being really not doing enough due diligence on my part to check out other seminaries and being turned off by the seminaries I did check out. So I ended up going to school for 2 years at the University of Michigan. It was an amazing experience as it relates to the people I met, the experiences I was able to have, friendships that I have even still to this day. But there was always something missing in my pursuits, and my passion wasn't there. I was more connected to going back to Detroit for services, and preaching always was on the forefront. And so when I finished that degree, I felt obligated after doing 6 years of study in this area to do something. And that's when I was recruited by the Navy. I was flown out to San Diego, California for a trip, and I saw the sunshine and the palm trees coming from Detroit, and I said, yeah, this might work.
I know that's right.
And I was told, and those that have been familiar with the military understand this, I was told I was going to be in San Diego, but when it was time to swear in, they said, time for to swear me in, they said, no, well, we're not going to be able to do San Diego, but we'll get you in California. There's this place, 29 Palms, California. 29 what? And I was like, this is not happening. I'm just staying back in Detroit. But what happened was I had promised my younger brothers, I was like, I'm going away, and I'm going to take you all with me. And they were already, California was on their mind. And I knew it would be a relief to my mother, and so I just couldn't backtrack on that. So even though I didn't know where in the world 29 Palms was, I didn't know what to expect. And also, I also probably personally felt a need to go somewhere different, probably because of some personal things that was going on in my life at the time. I just felt like starting off fresh somewhere else, whether it was wise or not, to let that more emotional aspect be a part of the decision. So my obligation to those 3 young men, that I promised that we were moving to California, and then just also kind of wanting to get away to see what a fresh start was, and being in for the most part, Detroit or Ohio for those last years, the challenge of going to California kind of was exciting in a way. And so I did that, and my uncle drove me from Detroit to California on the U-Haul. We had my SUV in the back, and when we get to 29 Palms, it was a culture shock.
I'm sure.
It was nothing there. And my uncle, he wasn't any help. He's riding. Oh God, what is this? Where? And so, but it's the desert, and the irony is that in that time in the desert, in that time away, I developed a lot spiritually.
Sure.
Yeah.
When you move into California, and that our story together begins there. But leading up to this point, who would you say ministerially? I know you would mention the Jennings, but beyond that, beyond the Jennings family, who would you say were influences in your life concerning preaching?
At the time, one of my favorite preachers growing up was Taylor Chapman. My mother, I would know his secretary, I would know his schedule. My mother would drop me off wherever he was preaching.
Taylor Chapman pastors in Detroit, Michigan.
Pastors in Detroit, Michigan.
Church
currently is Galilee Baptist
Galilee
Church.
Baptist Church.
Currently is over chairman of the late night, the National Baptist Convention. So that was a strong influence locally. So besides him and the Jennings locally, those were the guys that I listened to. And then there was
Well, if I can though, there was a kind of heyday of preaching in Detroit. Was that before your time, during your time? What was the church like, church scene like as you grew up in Detroit?
The heyday was before my time.
Okay.
But I was getting a lot of the tail end of it.
Okay.
And so we had guys like Dr. Robert Smith, but you had Dr. Caldwell. Caldwell was getting older. At that time. And so there was just a lot of strong preachers, but they didn't have the national name.
Gotcha.
Till to this day in Detroit, but not the national name that some of in the days before me, the guys in Detroit had.
Gotcha. Outside of Detroit, you were going to say?
Outside of Detroit, it was the guys that I was able to hear at the convention, and it was yourself, it was Dr. Parks, Donald Parks, and Jasper Williams. That's just the normal, the usual suspects.
Usual suspects.
Dr. Ralph West,
Sure.
and so on. Those guys you heard at the convention, you saw at Dr. Jerry Black, you would see at the convention, just to be able to see them walk in the halls, that made it worth the while. And to walk in the convention hall is a little bit different now, but to see the different sermon tables and different preachers, you'll be able to go and get your cassettes and go listen to and things of that nature. So that was my influence. I yet to broaden my expansion, and that's one thing I'll credit, of the many things I credit to you, expanding that world of preachers, besides the Charles Stanleys and guys that you will hear on television. In the Detroit area, I began to expand that tremendously, and that list would expand and be so diverse in comparison to how it was back then.
Sure. When did we actually meet? We didn't meet till you got to California?
We didn't meet formally until I moved to California. The first time I heard you, I was 15. You were preaching on Peter, betrayal of Jesus, following at a distance. Your first line was, in life you'll be ticketed if you tailgate, in the Christian life you'll be ticketed if you don't. And it was a magical night for me that night, because not only you was a lecturer before you from Los Angeles as well, who taught on Joseph, and he was amazing. And I remember, again, after hearing those sermons, having the passion to go back and read the Bible for myself and have a better understanding of those stories, because I heard the message. And so that entered into me finding out that you were going to Burnett every year right before Holy Week. And then so every year that was an annual thing. And I remember the year you got married. I didn't know you, but I knew when you got married because you didn't make it that year, and so on. So when I moved to 29 Palms, it was like, I got to get out of here. And it was, finding out what's close. Vegas was closed, San Diego was closed, and then Los Angeles was closed. And so military allows you 30 days when you check in to go and get yourself ready. And I used those. I spent that time going to Los Angeles. A lot of my brothers wasn't down yet, and I visited one another preacher and legend, the late E.V. Hill. I visited his church the first week, and then I visited Mount Sinai the next week, and I enjoyed it so much. I was like, I'm coming back next weekend, and then I enjoyed it so much. I was like, I'm coming back next weekend, but I'm gonna go to the men's Sunday school class as well. You were teaching the men's Sunday school class, and when I walked into the class, I introduced myself to you and said also that I've been hearing you at Burnett, and yeah, and it was just real gracious and stuff. And I was like a little kid calling back, saying, telling everybody I met you and stuff like that, and how we are. You ain't met nobody. But more than that, I fell in love with the church. I fell in love with your preaching on a different level, and it was more than hearing you on the road. It was just watching you minister in the pulpit, minister around people, and I wanted to be a part of that. So I ended up joining the church, and I just remember me being blown away by how nice you were to me. When you're saying, well, I'm preaching here, you mind coming with me? I'm like, oh, yeah, and being able to go to your house, meet your family. So all that was like a shell shock to me. It was just took me a minute to kind of process all that.
So for the record, though, if you've heard me first when you were 15, that puts me at around 20?
19, 20.
19, 20, okay. And when you get to Los Angeles, I don't remember the initial meetings.
Right.
I remember you coming to the church, and I just remember, man, honestly, just at a certain point, we were just a part of each other's life after that, man. Just like...
Yeah, it wasn't formal. I remember it was the prayer bowl. It was, and I stayed down. I got a hotel in Santa Monica, and I remember exchanging numbers, but I remember feeling like, I'm not going to hear from him. And then I remember that New Year's Day, waking up and you're like, yeah, so we're going to leave in about so-and-so time, so can you be at the house? I'm like, sure, give me the directions. And it just happened that way, just going with you to preach various places. And it was just naturally, then just those informal conversations. Oh, yeah, you know so-and-so. Sure. Oh, you asked me, have I read certain books? Have I thought about seminary and things of that nature? So the conversations just were happening organically, and it was just this natural commonality. So, you was going to breakfast spots. I was in love with breakfast food. So like, oh yeah, I'll go there any day, anytime. And different events at the convention we'll be talking about, and like, oh yeah, you were there. Like, yeah, I remember that sermon. Yeah, so-and-so preached that. And any book that you gave me or recommended to me at that time, I would go and buy it and rapidly read it and want to be able to ask questions and discussions about it, and going to the preaching classes, and at that point I was in seminary. It was the H.B. Charles year. But
we say about you mentioned not knowing terminology about things, but during that season of our lives, we would have never called that, discipling or whatever.
Right.
It was never, it was never conscious like that.
Consciously like that.
But it was really that what was going on during that time. And we were just in each other's house. You were coming down. When you were down, we were hanging out. We spent quite a bit of time together. Yeah. There's times I just would dissuade you from leaving a church service or meeting and driving home and end up on our couch, man.
Come down on Saturday, we have a meeting on Saturday, and I would be crazy, think I'm gonna drive back.
Right.
And I'll just crash on the couch, and I'll move Trey out the way. And all that was happening with me living far away. So just imagine how it would have been if I was in the city.
Right. And we were, And 29 Palms is exactly about how far from Los Angeles?
I would do it in 2.5 hours, but it's probably fairly about 3-hour trip.
Sure.
And there would be days, pretty much no trouble coming in, but those leaving Sunday afterwards, that it could take you a while to get home.
Sure. At a certain point, you and I started having serious conversations about your going further with seminary training. And we were discussing schools, and our conversations turned toward the Master's Seminary. And we ended up starting at the same time. I came off the road. I came off the road to go to school for a very brief time before I fell off the wagon. You pressed your way through, and when you started at the school, you also started on at the church part-time.
Right.
So that also was a shift in our relationship. But tell us about your experience at Master's Seminary, how it kind of shaped your theology, your philosophy of ministry.
It gave me a lot of affirmation to things I believe about the Scripture. First, it gave me a lot of affirmation about things I believed about the Scripture growing up. I wasn't one of those persons that went off to the seminary and felt like, oh, I've been cheated through my church experience. I was able now to put terminology, I was able now to connect it with history, I was able now to connect it with certain movements, you can say, and certain doctrines, but it gave me affirmation to that. The stuff I was learning with yourself, stuff I learned growing up in Detroit, and gave me the ability to express that more and to tie that more with church history and so on. It also challenged me in the area of Bible study, just realizing the need to study the Scriptures. Sometimes you can fall in love with reading books about the Bible and not the Bible itself, and so it was just an excellent experience for that. I had my own personal challenges. Some of it just was in the fact that I had been working for 3 years and a certain lifestyle I had come used to. And now to be back in seminary, I think I struggled with that personally, internally at times, and not having the freedom. And maybe some of my classmates I would call and they were on their second promotion or they were at and so on. And so at times that was difficult. I don't think I was able to focus and take advantage of my seminary experience all the times as I needed to, and still trying to make up for some of the things that I wasn't able to put as much into because I wasn't as appreciative of just the opportunity to receive formal training, excellent school, and just an amazing experience. But the best part of that experience was to be able to not just learn there, but for you given an opportunity at Mount Sinai to apply that in real life ministry. I think without that, the experience would not nearly been the same.
Sure. And, you and I share the same attitude of heart about this concerning seminary, that we're just troubled by the trend of guys going to schools to get a piece of paper, submitting themselves to people who don't believe the Bible. And then conversely, though, some of the sound biblical schools maybe are not as friendly. I don't know another word.
Right.
To the culture of black church maybe that we come out of. When we were there, it was maybe 10 black guys at the whole seminary.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. That's absolutely true.
And what key to that, man, I think probably, for you, and I guess I had been pastoring
absolutely
so many years. I agree with you. My time now, things were affirmed, but I had been exposed to the church ministry school, and I was well invested in my ministry already. But I think it was beneficial for you to be in that setting, but then we are sitting there together processing, now what does that look like in our setting?
In our setting, absolutely. That's what I was trying to say there, is that to be able to take that back to our cultural setting, take that back to practical, everyday ministry, and like you said, that balancing act, trying to get both of those worlds to meet sometimes don't happen. And it's a challenge when you talk about the trying to blend those cultural realities that you're dealing with as compared to what happens in the black church compared to what you hear in a more conservative seminary. But I think the easy answer to that is to be involved in ministry.
Sure.
While you do it. And if you're just sitting there taking that stuff in and not taking that to the context of people, and I think that goes outside of culture at that point. I think a lot of my classmates to this day probably even struggle doing ministry in their own cultural setting because they've been in front of the book. But when you're sitting at the desk in front of the couple who's struggling, you're dealing with these issues one-on-one and trying to walk them out. It's not all about grammar and syntax at that point. It's about real life.
Sure. I think the other benefit that we both had during that season is, man, it was just a great setting and time in our local church in Mount Sinai because as we were learning, we were just teaching the stuff, man. And and they just took it.
Yeah.
I mean, when you got there, we were trying to figure out elder leadership,
Christian education, curriculum.
We put down the traditional Sunday school and started writing our own Sunday school curriculum. I had been trying to do that, kind of pass that on to you when we were there. And I mean, it was just no resistance to that.
Right.
It was just good soil for us to be trying to flesh out what we were learning there, man. And I think that was also just an incredible benefit.
People were enjoying it, and the people were appreciative of it, and they were encouraging. So that was definitely to be at a church where not only they allowed you to do it, but they were welcoming to it, and more.
I think we went through a turning period. I'm gonna turn the corner a little bit, but I remember, man, I would not have used the term, but I just think I got burned out. And I remember alongside all of the other things I was doing, I was just doing quite a bit of counseling, and it was taking its toll on me. I was just worn out. And it's the first time in my ministry that Crystal came to a meeting. My wife came to a leadership meeting and said something has to change, which I think is just a cool thing, just that she felt the freedom to trust you guys, to just be straight up with what was going on. And I remember y'all sent me away to rest for a couple of weeks, and y'all was gonna figure it out. And when I came home, basically the recommendation of the men was that you needed to come on full time. And so that kind of also created another change. And you're finishing school, and we're kind of spending every day. I don't remember how we got much work done, though.
I don't know.
Your door is less than 10 feet from my door. And we are in each other's office.
All day.
All day.
All day. Sometimes I just sit on the stairs leading up to the office. and you know, it'll be ministry sometimes. Sometimes it'll be, you know, NBA. Sometimes.
Sure, yeah.
The latest show that we was watching together, it was, you know, just looking back on it, he didn't appreciate it as probably should have. And I don't know how can you appreciate it when you live in it at the same time, but it was, at that point, it became, you know, almost ridiculous at that point. So Chris will be calling and it'll be, well, you might as well come over to eat, man.
Yeah.
And that'll continue, and just the crazy ideas we'll come up with from ministry, and we need this and that, and just, it was fun.
It was. God had linked our hearts together. I was reading this morning a book, and it had, I'm reading on staffing. I'm reading a book, and just this morning I was reading a chapter that was dealing with executive pastors and, you know, what to look for in the executive pastor needs to have the senior pastor's DNA and all of those kinds of things. And it's just kind of crazy, again, without terminology and all of that kind of stuff. That was happening in our lives, in our relationship, and in the church organically without us paying any attention to that.
Yeah, no executive pastor 101.
No, none of that stuff, man.
I think I read a similar article maybe by Driscoll or something about 10 things the executive pastor should have or something. And that was, and again, at the time, it's not this formal stuff. It's nothing that, you know, I've been like, oh, let me write a dissertation on this or do a seminar to train others to do that. It was just the Lord had knitted our hearts together, and just natural things that we had in common, to sports outside of ministry, to same shows, same type of meals. So it was just, you know, yeah, I want a steak too, or I want my eggs too. You know? And it just flowed from there.
Two big things happened around the same time. We started talking about, in our leadership meetings, about relocation. And that conversation took off unexpectedly to us real quick. Yeah. The church had been in the location where we were all of my life. I pastored the church, my father had pastored before, and we were talking about that in leadership meetings, and I mean, it got really, really aggressive. The community had changed. There was no room to grow. We were doing Sunday school classes at places we had rented down the street.
Like a house.
People were parking several blocks down the street behind the supermarket, and there was no room for us to grow. The community had changed as well.
Demographics.
Yeah, and we kind of, when the leadership kind of got settled about it and threw it out to the church, just thinking that this was going to be a matter of prayer, they was like, let's do it. We're yeah, man. I mean, so we were shocked, and we're like, kind of full steam ahead. And we were thinking a temporary place and then a more long-term place once we get settled and established. That happens. We end up buying property. Right. The church was located going in the direction of downtown, we were saying. And we bought property at the foot of Baldwin Hills. Right. We bought it, but it was some months before the church we bought it from could relocate. So we had bought property we couldn't get into. We had sold our property that the folk were trying to get into. And we are leading the church through that. I think I was stressed out about it. The church was kind of living through it, but during that period, one day you come in the office and tells me that you had heard the news about the vacancy here. Right. Suddenly that you had heard in the news. And I was like, man, don't be playing like that. Don't be spreading rumors. Right. Then you like confirmed it. And we started having conversations, making our predictions on who is going to be the next pastor of Shiloh Metropolitan Baptist Church. Right. We don't know anybody in this church.
I had a good friend that I grew up with in Detroit that lived in Jacksonville, so I had visited here once before then, but that was it. Between the two of us.
Between the two of us.
That was the depths of our knowledge and experience.
But that didn't stop us from pontificating.
Yeah, no, it never stops. It never stopped the preacher from doing so.
We were handicapping.
Who needs information when you got an opinion?
Yeah, handicapping what was going to happen next here. And I guess, not often you see, large churches go through transitions. So we were just curious.
Yeah.
And, it was no thought about, we were knee deep in our own stuff.
Yeah, it was nothing malicious. It was just, that was church talk.
Yeah, we were just, when we started talking what happened in church, we're talking here, and, other things we knew about, but we were paying attention here.
If I can go back to even connect it together and also make the point a little broader, our conversations together in those informal times was times we came up with, maybe we should talk to guys about, relocating and things of that nature. Like, no, they're not gonna be open to it.
Right.
We threw it out at the meeting, and they grabbed hold to it, and then the church grabbed hold to it, and like you said, we had these plans for 54th Street. I mean, it was, and it was the blessing. The church that bought 1800 where we were previously located met on Saturdays, and so we were fine as meeting on Sundays, and so. But then they started to make their way known by not even though they weren't there on Sundays, they were there on Sundays.
Right.
By, some of the things they were changing, it was their building, their right. And so we decided to remodel there, and we had already in mind that, look, we were not going to be able to be here too long with 2 services. It's going to be months before we will be at 3.
Right.
About how we could plan to evangelize that community, because now we're in a community where it's more families, it's more of our culture, and so it was just all these big plans at 54th, and most of our conversations outside of the context of what was happening here was just, at the end of the day,
when we just updating what's the news of our church, in the church world.
Sort of the trade talk and what's going on.
Sure. But unconsciously, to be honest, something else is going on during this process. Like we say, the whole executive pastor thing, we would have never done. But you were taking on more and more responsibility during that time. When we finally shifted to 54th, we were worshiping the fellowship hall, remodeling the auditorium, everything is getting settled in, and I'm trying to study. And it's just like, you kind of like was overseeing so much of that and just kind of keeping me posted if something came up.
Yeah, I was sometimes, be right there, right when the construction opened up. I would be there first.
That was like 7 in the morning, 6 in the morning.
6 in the morning. There were a couple times I would walk in and you would be in there praying through the empty building. And I say that just to reaffirm the fact, because those outside be like, oh, they making this up. The mine was on 54th. So I would be rushing in there at 6, calling myself getting there early, and you'll be around with the construction around, walking around praying and stuff, and I just get join in praying. So, I mean, our mind and passion was, man, we're at this all-time opportunity where some of the things we weren't able to do, like all-night prayer, because it just was unsafe for the people to be parking there, and things that we wanted to do there on 54th, trying to get more facilities. We were in the process of a building down the street that we got through the auction, and sort of the cash reserves that we had, we kind of gambled and said, what, let's try to get more building for this. So it was full-fledged 54th Street, Mount Sinai, you preaching and me helping out, and it was only God can make sense of it, because to me and you, even to this day, it felt like that's the way it should have been. It just should have been, I mean, it was more and more, I was becoming more and more ready, more and more trust from the church and staff and others to do other stuff, and it just kind of freed you up to pray and preach and your road opportunities and spend time with the family.
Sure.
And it was seemingly shaping up.
And during that period, I'm watching your development, and then you are doing a lot more preaching. We are sharing preaching series,
Right.
Which was giving me natural breaks, and then you were getting a lot of opportunities to preach as well. So I was watching you grow as a preacher as well during that period. And I said to the leaders when going into 2008, saying to church, I said, y'all pray, because some church it's probably a year, I'm predicting some church going to snatch George up. And a few months in, I get invited here to preach, which was a crazy thing because our biggest concern that weekend, if I remember correctly, was that you were scheduled to be out of town that weekend. Am I right?
I was in Atlanta preaching.
You were in Atlanta, and I was coming here, and the question was, should you stay home and preach?
Or should you move your date?
Or should I? Oh, man, that was our big issue. And somehow I came here and preached, and it was a good day here. But you and I didn't talk for a day or so. And then when we kind of talked, when I got home, I said, hey, man, you ain't asked me nothing about how it went. And you had already heard how it had gone.
I already heard. The good friend that I referenced earlier still lived in Jacksonville, and he was at the service. And he called me as soon as I got out of my service in Atlanta. My phone was blowing up for him. So I knew everything what happened, what it said on the program, who was there, how many people was there, and so on and so on. So I was in that position where whenever Doc get around to call me, we'll catch up. But
Sure.
I already know what I mean.
But it is fair to say that you sensed the Lord was up to something before I did. And I just I wasn't going in, I didn't want to go any further. And you just like, dude, just do what they ask you.
Yeah.
It's not going to hurt.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was more in the ability not to suppress it as much as you were, you know. so
I was in denial.
Yeah, I mean, I had more of the angle where I could just, accept the fact that something's going on here.
Sure.
But I think for you, rightfully so, there had to be this caution and reluctantness and awareness of your current assignment, and that was the case. I mean, again, somebody outside maybe suggested they're making this up. But when we got home after all that, it was a funny story. And okay, so when they supposed to be finished with
when
the
they supposed to be finished? No, I'm going to tell you something crazy, man. The Sunday I got back was our first Sunday in the new sanctuary.
Yeah.
we had ribbon cutting.
Ribbon cutting ceremony. And are we going to walk over from the fellowship hall?
Right.
We was mapping that all out, and we were mapping out the resources of things we could do innovative and making sure we had enough reserves. And we had the building on the street that we had just won in the auction, and who we going to get to rebuild that, what we're going to use that for. It's going to be rental property. It's going to be construction property. Trying to get that in the right zone, and so it was.
And then, man, in the building that was the church offices,
the
last thing to get done was my study.
Right.
And
figure out where I was going to be in your books. Who's going to be?
Man, that was my big crisis right there, man. Y'all needed to finish my room so my books could go in.
We were working.
We were working, but alongside of that, things were moving fast here. Yeah. And it was kind of hard not to pay attention.
Absolutely.
That this thing was moving forward.
Right.
And for the record, and we will only speak of this in the most generic terms, George, we had been through this before. We had been through this before.
Right.
So we once before, and I mean, our leadership had been through this, which is one of the epic nights.
Yeah.
One of the epic church meetings, leadership meetings. I had to kick you out, man. when the guy said, well, Pastor, go home preaching. Let's see what the Lord gonna do. George's like, what? So I mean, we had been around this block. So I think it just kind of was what it was a little bit. But it was moving fast.
Yeah, it was moving fast. And the day would consist of, I mean, us working the whole day and not talking about it. And on that street, Dean of 54, if you're in your car and you saying, well, hop in for a minute. And then it was with that next 2 or 3 hours, you know, well, let's run and get something to eat real quick. And then the next day it'll be the same thing. We was on to the next, and if there wasn't any news, there wasn't nothing to talk about.
Right.
It was more on, you know, where's the books going to go? I mean, all that stuff. I mean, those shelves in the office, what's my office now to this day, was constructed and plotted because trying to make room for that.
And then, man, at a certain point, though, I mean, I think you really started. I never will forget, man. I had started the Sermon on the Mount, and I was in the Beatitudes, and I got up. You know, I would get up one Sunday and each other on Sunday and say, you know, we're working our way through the Sermon on the Mount. Just began. We're in the Beatitudes. I think after one Sunday, you was like, I don't think you need to say that anymore. I don't know if you're going to finish the Sermon on the Mount here.
Yeah.
And maybe it should be your goal just to get through the Beatitudes.
Right.
And I think I remember that conversation was just so surreal to me. And this is like not a long period of time. If I was visiting here in Jacksonville at the end of May, beginning of June, they were ready to vote here the end of July.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when we get there, man, the conversation starts about you coming to Jacksonville with me. And those are our conversations, just kind of the typical conversations shifted a little bit. But we also are in a process where once I accept the call here, the church council, the leaders, the pastors, we had 2 big meetings. The first one was for me to just kind of set up how things were supposed to run in the interim without a pastor. And then the next meeting I was supposed to have was about helping them organize a search process.
Right.
And that first meeting, I basically I had the pages of stuff there, but the point of that document was that George was going to run things till y'all got a pastor. And he's going to do the preaching unless y'all were bringing in somebody specifically for them to hear. And he would do the weekly preaching and appoint if one of the other guys would preach. And the leaders accepted that. And like the next day at work, I took your lunch, and I was like, man, I don't think you're going to make it to Jacksonville. And that became the next meeting. The next meeting about the actual search process became a conversation with the leaders about you. And that meeting ended up with the men prayerfully deciding to recommend you to the church as the next pastor. And the crazy part about it is, I am announcing my leaving and the church voting for its next pastor kind of like at the same, literally, not kind of, at the same time.
Yeah. Which part? Yeah.
So I think my last week is the church anniversary, 2008. And I came to Jacksonville that Monday. Crystal and the kids made it down that Wednesday or Thursday.
Right.
I preached my first Sunday here, the fourth Sunday in September 2008. You preached at Sinai. And that Monday, I flew back to lead the meeting.
Right.
And you were called to the church virtually unanimously.
Right.
Which is just surreal.
It is.
We don't really talk much about this, Because when it come up, we like, oh no, that's just. It was just all really surreal. But maybe just one more section. You're now at your assignment basically as long as I've been at my assignment.
Mm-hmm.
But this is your first pastorate.
Right.
First, you take on weekly preaching responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
What has been the most surprising thing to you about pastoral ministry these first 4 years?
Wow. I think the biggest surprise has been for me is to be honest about it, to be the periods of the emptiness of time that comes along with it. This sense of giving your all, doing your all, and just really learning it, especially as a like you said, first pastor, a young preacher, and just allowing what James says in James 1-3, your patience, being patient in the real sense. And just really trying to balance the emotional highs with the emotional lows.
Sure.
And not realizing how those shifts take place. Where you can have, to be honest, a good Sunday as it relates to how you think the sermon went, but then you think about maybe the attendance wasn't where it needed to be. Or you can have a good Sunday, how you think the sermon may have went, and the attendance being strong, and then the offering not being where you need it to be. Think about where you want it to be. Okay, and then having a week where you got caught up with other things and you wasn't able to prepare for the message as you want, and it showed. And now you have this sense of semi-depression, if you will, because you didn't give the people, you feel as if you didn't give the people what they deserve because you allowed other things to crowd your plate, or just those shiftings. I just, for somebody that felt like I could handle the best of blows, and growing up in the mean streets of Detroit City, be able to handle that, and just the moments you feel like no matter how true it is that nobody understands but you.
Sure.
And the sense of all those things, it's just blown me away that those things could happen. And then the other side of it that I've been surprised about, just the joy that you feel in doing it on the same token. Just the joy, not a sense of pride or arrogance or conceit or a pompous spirit, but just the joy to know when a mother or someone who's been struggling let you know that you've been a blessing to them.
Sure.
That you that meant something, or to see a young person as you preach paying attention that may have been sleeping the last year or so.
Sure.
Or there's not a text messaging. So those emotional aspects of it has been a surprise because of my advantage being under most of those other things I experienced. I was in the process of being behooved by you to always be working on the sermon, and then the intenseness of seminary training. So I was able to transition and handle the weekly prep aspect of it and things a lot better maybe than the average person would have.
Sure. I was talking to a friend yesterday about the fact that, I think we need to do less whining in ministry because it's a wonderful privilege that we have. On one hand, you shouldn't be whining, and there are people in our pews that are going through a lot more difficult struggles. But yet, it does not erase the fact that ministry is hard work and it's hard in strange ways.
Right.
Because if you take your preaching seriously, you live and die with that sermon.
Yes, sir.
And then Monday hits and you got to process the next one,
Yeah.
whatever it is next, the Bible study or whatever it is, but you really need some time to, for lack of a better term, detox
Right.
from that last sermon. And I would just say, if your heart is soft, you cannot minister to a mother who's having a trouble with her child, or see some saint sick, or do a funeral and just be like, okay, well, what's next on the schedule?
Right.
Those things weigh on your heart. You know, it's an amazing thing in 2 Corinthians, I guess it has to be chapter 11, where he gives all of this persecution that he's going through, and then it says on top of that is my anxieties for the churches.
Yeah.
And that is hard, that hardness of ministry in terms of how it affects you spiritually, mentally, and emotionally, and how you have to strive for healthy rhythms. I think that's a difficult thing for people to explain as preachers, for the members in the pew to get. And sometimes they just think sometimes it's not serious, take seriously what we do.
Yeah, it's not possible in a real sense. You know, you think about it, I think about, you know, October's Financial Stewardship Month, and trying to challenge the people as it relates to their stewardship and their giving to the church, and it has to be done. I have to remind people of that commitment. And then at the same time, you may look at somebody who you counsel or you know that's going through a certain sickness, a certain season, and they're at church, and you want to almost call an audible right then and there. But then there's this greater context that's going on, of balance and the importance of the preparing of a preaching schedule and knowing those seasons and shifting through that and just trying to deal with those realities, that you can't depend on that 30 to 45 minutes or hours so that you have in the presentation of the message to be the holistic approach of ministering to people in their situation, and trying to just figure out what that is, what that looks like. What that small groups, is that cell groups, is that support groups, is that visitation, more visitation of the sick, and then your time running short, and then your own emotional issues, your own shortcomings come. It's no way that a person, better yet, almost another preacher compared to the other preacher, can measure that there's no way the pew can measure that.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah.
A couple of more questions, and we'll maybe go through these quickly. You are from the mean streets of Detroit, George, but you would describe Detroit as a church town, yes?
It is.
What would you say are the distinctions between that and what your experience is pastoring the church culture in general in Los Angeles? I know it may be weird for me to ask, but whatever it is, I'm a part of the water. I grew up there.
Absolutely.
I mean, it was all I knew. But maybe as a person who is kind of transplanted there.
Yeah, speaking to yourself and people that grew up in Los Angeles, there's definitely been a shift. And there may have been a time where Los Angeles was a church town. Today is not that day. Some obvious competing realities: Mickey Mouse, the beach, the traffic, the sunshine, the weather, has diluted that. The shift in the culture within itself, a lot of people migrating to find better bang for their buck as it relates to real estate, to areas further east and west and south and north of Los Angeles, has just really changed the culture of the city from a church perspective. And so it's a real unique challenge to pastor in LA currently, with all those competing realities and just the shift in the culture, in the demographics, in the attention of people. There's so many other things that they can do on the weekend, and sort of church can kind of get in where, if you will, where it fits in. Because, and then, you know, even the extracurricular activities for most children is slated to Saturdays and Sundays now. Whereas in other areas, you wouldn't dare put that on a Sunday. In a Texas or maybe in a Jacksonville. In LA, you'll find kids sports on Sunday morning. that are taking place, and so it makes it real difficult, and it makes it difficult from the standpoint of, as well, many of the sister churches are in the transition period in Los Angeles, and so they're trying to wade through the economic crisis, the shifting in the culture, and many of where some of the stronger churches were in a certain area of Los Angeles. Now that area is becoming more Hispanic, and trying to do ministry in light of those realities, in light of some of the housing crisis that people have faced, and the shift that people make, and ever entering in and entering out place. And so it makes it challenging, but it makes it at the same time also fun, because you always have to come up with something, in a sense, innovative, to try to draw people in. Obviously, I'm not talking about the preaching or anything of that nature. I'm talking about the ministry that takes place on a day-to-day.
I think one of the other two things I would just note, that this was just the case when I was there, but I note this, people ask me what's the difference between Jacksonville and Los Angeles in terms of church culture. There are a lot of large churches here in Jacksonville, but there is a variety and diversity of the styles of ministry, so that there may be a large charismatic church here, but there are, Shiloh may be a larger non-charismatic church, and there's no one model that you would look at to say you got to do it that way in order to be successful. But in Los Angeles, the larger churches are Pentecostal charismatic word faith, and I think that's a pressure on people.
It's a burden on other guys to feel like I have to do that in order to be successful, or I have to measure what's successful in my ministry by what's successful in their ministry. And this one-size-fit-all type of mentality easily creeps into people's mentality, into people's mind. And
some of the only solution to some of that is, we're not talking about this to produce a golden key, but the only solution to that is you just got to be faithful to your own assignment.
You have to do what you've been called to do, your convictions.
Absolutely.
And not waver from that, and measure success from a more expansive standpoint, and not be totally pragmatic. And so, which
is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely a good thing. That's why I say hidden in those cons are certain pros. To be able to say, well, we may not have this level of attendance, but as a percentage-wise, these many are those who do go to Bible study, or are faithful givers, or attend regularly. There's a lot of people that show up once a month, or churches with a large membership, but it's a shifting of attendance. And so to try to maximize those things, and just praise God just the same, and be just as happy as for what it is that the Lord has given me, and what the Lord is doing. And that's not a knock on what everybody else is doing, but praise God for what it is that He's allowed us to do in this particular season, and still trusting Him to do more and better.
You're still a new pastor.
Absolutely.
But you've been at the assignment 4 years. Maybe I'll end with this. What would you learn where if you were sitting with a guy who is starting his first pastorate? What advice have you just kind of learned, good and bad, that maybe, if you had an opportunity to say to a guy who's getting started, what would you say?
Yeah, and there's a lot of things I would say, and I would try to be fair in that which I would be saying to him as it relates, because the uniqueness of the situation that I fell into. To be at a church already, the church already familiar with me. They already know my weaknesses. They already know my strength. It's nothing. There's certain advantages that I had built in that just will make it difficult for me to just nakedly give somebody certain levels of advice that I've learned. But then there's certain things that's just common to whatever situation. Guard your life, guard your lifestyle as much as you can. Stay connected to the heart of people. do whatever it takes to know the spirit. I'm not talking about the mess, and the gossip and what people are saying. I'm talking about people's longings and their passions and what it is that they're looking for in the ministry. More connecting with them than it is just singularly looking to your staff maybe, or the deacons or the leaders. It's those people that come up every week, those people that you're preaching to. It's finding some way to do that. And there's nobody has the answer to what that looks like. In different contexts, that looks different. But doing that and taking preaching as serious as you can take it.
Mm-hmm.
Taking your preaching as serious, your preparation as serious. Don't like the word networking, but getting around other guys that have done it longer than you, or does it better than you, and not trying to necessarily, and preachers understand what I say when I say this, not necessarily trying to get around them to get a preaching engagement or something like that.
I hear you.
But just to get those informal wisdom that comes from just being in the same atmosphere as certain people. Mm-hmm. I go back to me being around yourself, me being around my dear pastor in Detroit. I grew up under Pastor James Hinton Sr. It wasn't, let me sit down, let me show you this. But if you're around long enough, and so you still need to do that, but and you have to be more conscious of it now because your time is so valuable and it's so scarce at this point. And so just get around those senior guys, those guys that you know that you can learn from and find creative ways to be around them. It probably doesn't go 2 or 3 months that I'm not around you in some way.
Right, you're right.
They're trying to figure out what conferences. Probably already got the next 3 lined up, and it's valuable.
Yeah, that's very good advice. Very good advice. I appreciate that. I think I want to end just by saying that, man, you put me on a plane to Jacksonville, and we had no thought or discussion about what our relationship. It was just it just wasn't processing that. Mm-hmm. Not that it was going to adversely affect our relationship. Just kind of our relationship was in a rhythm where that just wasn't a discussion. Right. And just you've been here to preach for me every year I've been here. Mm-hmm. I've been there to preach for you, which is just the most awkward thing in the world, to go back and be an evangelist at the church. It's just awkward, but I just want to say that, and I think this is where we would disagree. You'd probably say it has something to do with me and my leadership there, but I think it has something to do with your leadership there, that that door is open, and you have a sense of security about your own ministry, and you welcome me back. A lot of our relationship hasn't changed. You still, if you learn something, you call me here and say, man, you need to be working on this down there. like we still 10 feet away from each other in that office, right. Man. But I want to I said that to say thank you for just being content enough in your own skin, in your own calling, where it just hasn't been any tension or pressure about our relationship, the life of the church or any of those kinds of things. It would be hard for us to describe. We just kind of, the rhythm never changed in us.
And I mean, the person outside again maybe think, oh, they're making that up. But I mean, I thank you 1,000 times more. And I just felt, that there needed to be a conscious effort on my part. And at times I know that it's uncomfortable, uneasy for you. But I think it's almost selfish for me to feel as if the church needs to remember, appreciate, the life and legacy of yourself at the church. And I think I say it's selfish, it helps me in understanding to them that, hey, this is not about me. This is about the ministry. And I know there are people there that, many people there that probably, which I wish Doc never left, me being one of them. But it gives them that season to see you, to love on you, to appreciate the gift that God has given you as it relates to explaining the Word of God. And
it's kind of different, though, in my situation than with Crystal and the kids, because they just show up at any time.
Yeah, they just show up.
But I also am really grateful about it because, and I guess this is a sign of me getting older, particularly the last time I was there and you all had kind of uncovered some pictures of my dad.
Right.
My family roots were tied there, my father's ministry, and I guess that is a blessing. And you don't have to do that, and I just want you to know I appreciate that.
And that's the uniqueness of the situation. It's not just a church you pastored.
Right.
This is a church you grew up in.
Right.
Your father pastored.
Right.
For 40 years. And I think that's even more of a reason for myself to be sensitive to that and to make a conscious effort to always remind, be it someone who is newer to the church, to know that this didn't just start. Just didn't start here. And the church has, which is important to know, that where the church would be in this wherever mythical ideal world that exists, where the call and providence of God of bringing you here did not exist, that would have been just it's a joy to even think about what that reality could have been with your preaching and with my opportunities to work more behind the scenes and things like that. And I at times how I long for that to be the reality.
Sure.
But the Lord didn't have us to be so. And so, we've benefited in so many hands.
Man, and Crystal just
ways.
a couple of weeks ago told me, because learning it takes time learning that rhythm with someone else, me being here. And, Crystal reminded me just a couple of weeks ago, she said, okay, but remember there was a time when George got on your nerves all the time. And that you all relationship had to grow.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, man.
That's the magic of time.
Man, man. We all that stuff
this stuff
moved
just
out.
happened, yeah, every time.
Yes,
every
sir,
day
man.
was like Sunday. But, yeah, absolutely. And it's unfair in a sense to the others to try to put it that way and not see the story behind that.
Sure.
And the development behind that.
Right.
And the tough conversations and that had to take place at times where it did, and the correction that had to take place on my part, and me having being humble to receive that correction. So it's not a sense of everything was flowery beds of ease.
Right.
But I think, be honest, to add to that though, it was a mutual love that made that easier, and made it feel like when it did have to happen, it was like, well, let's hurry up and make it happen so we can find out, what do you think about the third season of The Wire?
Right. Absolutely.
And that's the same way now. If it goes a couple weeks or so, if I don't hear you, I know once I catch you, it's going to be a long conversation.
Right.
Right. Because you got to catch up on everything.
Everything. Yeah.
And that's just the nature of relationships. And a lot of times we don't afford people the time. I know myself personally, it's a personal struggle, and all of my level of social relationships, affording people enough time for that development, for that closeness to take place.
I bought a book just for the title, but it's a great book that it's called relationship's a mess worth making, and you know,
Right.
that's kind of what it is. It's a messy process, but it's worth
Yeah.
it. And I appreciate you, man, and I love you, and I'm proud of you,
you
man.
more, yeah.
And I'm looking forward to all that God is going to keep doing in your life and ministry, man. And thank you for taking this time to chat.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, all right. God bless.